and welcome to Raw Politics. I'm Jo Moir and I'm joined today by news god Sam Suchdavid. Could you stop doing this to me?
Stop reading words just straight off the Word doc. You're not Ron Burgundy.
Hello, Sam.
Hello.
And in Auckland, Tim Murphy, who hasn't messed with my script. Hello, Tim.
Hi, guys, and a sad farewell, Jo.
It is. It's incredible, great sadness that I deliver the news that this is, in fact, Sam Suchdavid's final Raw Politics in country as he goes off on his, quote, Sam-batical, which I hate, because apparently he doesn't think that campaigns and elections are fun, so he's disappearing until January next year.
No more bread and butter for me, Jo. I've had my fill. I'm on a carb cleanse, hence leaving the country. But look, I'm going to be back. I might be dialing in. I'm sure I will be dialing in fact, from overseas to offer takes from exotic parts of the world. And look, I've only got a few days left, but I want to assure you, Tim, that I am taking things very seriously, and I'm going to continue a professional approach for as long as I'm here. And I'm just really locked in and 100% committed to Newsroom.
For those of you who are listening and not watching, Sam has just graced himself with a pair of sunglasses and a beach hat. So, I basically blame Tim for this anyway because you signed off on the Sam-batical. So thank you.
Well, it's not just a holiday, is it? He's going off to the EU for a highly important educational for the next 2 weeks.
Indeed.
Then off to the climes of Europe and cricket fields of India and so on, correct?
Indeed. A few months in Europe, and as you say, I am going to be doing some reporting on the EU-New Zealand relationship and some of the key issues in regards to Europe. But then the less educational, less professional part takes place with a few weddings and some gallivanting around the continent. So looking forward to it. But I will be keeping an eye on proceedings from afar, don't worry, and judging you both.
I feel an EU book coming on, Sam.
Right, well, moving on from that great sadness, today we're going to take a look at the bonfire of ministers in Chris Hipkins' 5 short months as leader, and then we'll throw forward to the week-long trade trip to China next week. As always, we'll wrap up with some recommendations. First, to Michael Wood, officially gone burger. Add to that list of ministers that are gone in the time that Chris Hipkins has been Prime Minister, we have Stuart Nash and Meka Whaitiri as well, and sort of smaller scale stuff-ups have been Ministers Jan Tinetti and Kitty Allen. Tim, are the wheels completely coming off here?
Not so much the wheels, but to use another transport analogy from his portfolio, I think the battery is just running out of juice. Jacinda lost petrol from her tank. I think the remnants of her government, the battery's just running low now. I wonder whether there's sort of a feeling of fate creeping in where they can kind of see, even if they can scrape back in October, that it's going to be a less satisfactory arrangement of governing, and there are fewer talented people perhaps right there to play the roles they need to perform. You just get the sense there's a little bit of fate creeping in as well.
What's your thoughts been sort of watching it all unfold this week, Sam? I mean, you saw a pretty fed up, worn down figure in Chris Hipkins when he announced that resignation this week of Michael Wood. We've learnt just recently, actually, that 12 times that the Cabinet Office spoke to him turned out to be 16. Like, I mean, come on. Anyway, what's your sort of succinct analysis of I guess how this has played out for not only in terms of Michael Wood and how he's dealt with it, but what it means for Chris Hipkins' leadership as well?
Yeah, look, I'm just going to steal shamelessly from News Hub's political editor, Jenna Lynch, who said, bread and butter is toast, you know?
It's a good line.
It's a great line. It is a very great line. But it's of course he's immensely frustrated, Hipkins, and he has every right to be because he has been trying to reset this narrative, to run a very sort of focused, narrow campaign focused on the cost of living, these other essentials. And, that's not necessarily going entirely well for him, but at least if you were focusing on that, it's what New Zealanders are really focused on. But instead he's having to deal with all this stuff. So it's not really anything that he seems to have done wrong. He's just being let down repeatedly by his ministers. And the Michael Wood case, when you tell someone, there was this whole ongoing process, as you say, not 6, not 12, but 16 times. But then when this all came out and he lost the transport portfolio, and you have the Prime Minister saying, go away, like, tell me if there's anything else. And this has only come up now. I mean, I just don't understand how that happens. Like, does he not care, Michael Wood, about this? It just doesn't make sense.
And I think that's a good point. And this kind of came up with Chris Hipkins when he announced that Michael Wood had resigned. This issue of, is there respect for the Prime Minister's office? Because you've got two situations now, both Stuart Nash and Michael Wood, who had, ballsed up and had several conversations with Chris Hipkins in person where they had been asked, is there anything else? Do I need to be worried about this? And they said no. And so you've got to wonder whether, they just think they can get away with it. There's an alternative line running at the moment that maybe Michael Wood has got something even worse going on, and this is the thing he's decided to use to, fall on his sword so that whatever the other thing is doesn't become a problem. And I think the other thing that needs to be pointed out too is bear in mind that this stuff all happened under Jacinda Ardern's leadership. So, Michael Wood and the Auckland shares and the conflict and all the Cabinet Office stuff was when Jacinda Ardern was Prime Minister. Stuart Nash's stuff that he did in terms of conflicts was when Jacinda Ardern was Prime Minister. And here Chris Hipkins is having to deal with the fallout of it all. And Tim, I'm interested in your thoughts on that because we heard Chris Hipkins announce a whole bunch of things, 5 things that he's going to do in order to try and clean up some of the stuff around conflicts. In reality, was Jacinda Ardern just running a really relaxed ship?
Not just in this area, but you do pick it up a little bit from other things that have gone on with policy and with some of the other disciplines in a government, and in party selections, where the Prime Minister's wish wasn't adhered to, there was pushback and so on. You do wonder whether her person and team management wasn't as good as it could have been as a Prime Minister. And so whether that comes back to the Prime Minister's office and the Chief of Staff because the Prime Minister is busy, it could be an issue there. Similarly, is it an issue for Chris Hipkins personally as a Prime Minister that people don't have regard for him? He's a peer. He's been their peer for years and they feel equal to him and he's not got the extra star factor or pull. Or is it his Chief of Staff and office who aren't regarded and aren't listened to and aren't perhaps responded to in the same way?
I remember, and this has always stuck with me, in the latter days of the national government, a backbencher described the setup to me as being like a benign dictatorship. I think it was like Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, where you sacrifice your personal freedoms for greater prosperity, and that's what it was like for the national government. Like, yes, you didn't have as much freedom to share your views, but you knew it was going to guarantee you or be close to guaranteeing you seats and electoral success. And there's probably a bit of that under Jacinda Ardern, and that's just eroded, right? They're no longer well short of being anywhere near a majority at the next election, not even in the 40s. We're talking low 30s at the moment, right? So that probably erodes some of the discipline that's around this. And I think if you look at the Nash issue and the Wood issue, you can argue, is this actually related to Hipkins or not? But I think the broader vibe is such as once you start to become in political peril and you've got people freaking out about, am I going to be able to come in on the party list? Am I going to hold my electorate? Then that probably does start to chip away at some of that discipline.
I think you're right about that, but also it's not as if, they are in the situation that National was in 2020. I mean, it's a tight race. It's anyone's game. More polls than not are still predicting Labour, Greens, Te Pāti Māori to be governing. And yes, I take your point that they're not going to have as many MPs and a lot won't come in on the list and a lot of electorate seats will potentially flip as well. But it's not as if it's like, oh, well, game over, let's move on. Like, they're in an absolute fight for their life and, should be treating it a little bit more seriously, I would have thought, than every single week doing their best to make them look like a completely and utterly ridiculous government.
Well, as well as that, Jo, there's the fact that there are some big, hairy, ugly problems in policy areas that some of them might have lost a bit of the taste of going forward with. It's this fatalistic view that can creep in where you're not going to get a strong mandate, you might be hampered by the Greens, you haven't got some of your fellows among you because some are retiring, some have gone, some are sacked and so on, but there's still these intractable big policy problems that you're saying, have I got the heart for that beyond? So it starts to I think, effective performance and cabinet cohesion and caucus cohesion. And it's just a bit of a fraying now that will take a lot of leadership from Hipkins to restore.
Let's look ahead now to Chris Hipkins' significantly huge delegation. He's taking to China next week for a trade and tourism trip. I think a good starting point here, Sam, is should he be nervous leaving the country for 6 days?
Maybe he's thinking about defecting. He's just not going to come back. He's like, I've had enough. China is a much more stable political system. If any of my ministers or any ministers betray the leader over there, they disappear. So shouldn't make light of it, actually. Sorry. But yes, I think there'll be a little trepidation. It will be it's a recess week, right? So
no, it's
not.
Week.
Oh God, even worse. So good luck, everyone. Good luck, government. Yeah, look, I think he'll be worried, but hopefully there's enough trust, and I think these things tend to come in peaks and troughs, right? So we might be entering a little bit of a slow period. Although now I say that there will be a leadership spill while I'm away and while he's away. So good luck.
Well, given you're the China expert, I'm going to get you to sort of tell us what you think is the most important thing that's going to happen or should happen on this trip. I will be going on this trip because Sam will be in Europe. I mean, we're just so adventurous at the moment here at Newsroom. So Sam, what do you think needs to be achieved, I guess, over the course of the next week in China?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's hard to see obvious achievables or takeaways. You go on these sorts of trips and you have some sort of memorandum of arrangement to cooperate in this area or that area. But actually, the problem is that the space is so narrow with China in terms of areas where we are on the same page and can work together or advance things in terms of research or collaboration that it's difficult. So I think this is in large part symbolism. It's about saying, look, New Zealand is here to do business with China. We've got this relationship. Look at all these business people I brought with me and they can talk about the things that they can do and offer to the Chinese market. So that's the main element of it. And I think that the sort of laser-like focus on trade is no mistake. I mean, obviously, China is our largest trading partner, so it's critical, but also it is an area where it's relatively uncontentious because, as Sir John Key has said in the past, we have lamb chops and wool and dairy, milk powder, whatever else that we want to sell, and they've got, 500 million people in their middle class who want to buy it. So that sort of mercantilist approach is helpful in terms of smoothing the way. It'll be partly about avoiding pitfalls, I think, any sort of mistakes or missteps, or when you talk about human rights, situation in Xinjiang, militarization of the South China Sea and the Pacific, of course. So that goes two ways. One, that he's not too hawkish, doesn't cause offence to anyone over the end, but on the other hand, that he's not seen as kowtowing to Xi Jinping, to the Chinese government, and that he's not pulling his punches, because I think New Zealanders do expect that we should be speaking out on issues of concern. So it is a sort of a tight line for him to walk there.
Yeah, I mean, on that, Tim, I think in terms of and bear in mind, Chris Hipkins has actually done quite a few trips now in a short space of time, despite saying when he became Prime Minister that he'd do a couple of small trips. This trip seems to be the one where there is the most risk for getting it wrong or not being quite right in the foreign policy space, because, the other meetings he's had have been sort of European meetings. Is there going to be a lot of advice and a lot of sort of just keep it short and succinct and don't go into any sort of too dangerous territory? Do you think that's kind of going to be what's said to him ahead of this, Tim?
Yeah, Jo, I think he'll be on a tight leash. I think he'll be highly programmed. Already, Sam, today I see he was asked about Biden's comment about Xi being a dictator and obviously demurred and said, well, I don't think that. So that's not kowtowing, but it's just putting a pretty obvious point out there that the guy's not a dictator, despite you saying before that people are taken away and in China and dealt with if they don't agree with people. I think the problem for Hipkins is it's new to him, this global diplomacy. He will have read Sam's book, The China Tightrope, and I'm sure, therefore, if he hasn't, he'll be briefing on that how many hour flight north to Beijing. But yeah, it's new, and it's not easy to step into that kind of role and offer much. So that's why they're on a tight leash. And those who know these things will just be feeding enough that is courteous, is respectful, says some of the things that Nanaimoto and others will have been saying up there and to their colleagues, but doesn't try too much here.
Yeah, the other really fascinating thing about this trip is, and I alluded to it in the intro there, is the size of the delegation that's going. It is a chocker plane, like to the point that they are being very, very strict on luggage, both check-in and carry-on. Like the restrictions are through the roof because it is just such a full plane. And what I kind of wonder about that is, you know, given there's been so much talk about diversifying, not having all of our eggs in one basket, is there almost a little bit of an irony, I guess, to taking like literally every sort of trade and tourism person you can find that exists in New Zealand and bundling them on a plane to China, when at the same time you're saying out the other side of your mouth that you're, you know, wanting to worry about all these other markets?
To a degree. I mean, I think there is a reality, and that reality is that for all that we want to diversify beyond China, China is the main player for us. So these businesses are already doing a lot of trade, it's exporting a lot of goods to China, so it makes sense for them to be there. And I think the approach that some people talk about, and I agree with it overall, is that it should be China and, not China or. So it's not about us sort of pulling down the shutters and moving all of our product out of the Chinese market elsewhere. We're still going to have to trade with China, and it makes sense to give our businesses opportunities there. But you can say, is there an issue of resource that would, you know, the diplomatic resource that goes into this, could that be better going into, say, the United Arab Emirates or the the GCC Gulf Cooperation Council and the sort of stalled trade negotiations there? India, for example, is one that's being talked about a lot. And then you've got the areas where we are making progress, like the UK, where the FTA has just come into force, the EU, where it's about to. And I know that he is heading there, the Prime Minister, the start of July. But would it be better to have people on the ground trying to sort of implement that and smooth the way for businesses to actually work into that market? So it's a difficult one.
Tim, just from a domestic perspective, there's a lot going on in New Zealand. We're not far out from an election. I mentioned before about this being, you know, number 6, I think it is, trip 5 or 6, for Chris Hipkins. Is there a little bit of danger, I guess, in being out of the country so much in an election year? Because historically, prime ministers are very careful about making sure that they're on home soil as much as they can be, especially at this point, you know, when we're talking 3 or 4 months out from an election.
There is, from his own point of view and from Labour's, but the greater good here is that in all of these places, our chance has arisen after so many years of historic isolation and impediment. So you've got to grab it with both hands, and that's why I think the trade and the investment part of this is so vital. They're all going because it's a big chance. And yes, Sam, we don't want to be making it China, sort of diminishing China as a trade partner, but they should also be going for whatever they can get now. And I think the same for New Zealand, just putting the party political and government fortune aside, he has to do it. Whoever was there needed to do it. The chance came up, they needed to do it. And similarly, I think with some of those other trips, yes, you know, in a classic election period, if all was being equal and you had sort of nice placid time ahead of you, you'd stagger these things and not do them. But I think, you know, it's the right thing to do for the country. It's the right thing for all these other outfits to go and try and work for the country and for themselves. And he'll just have to hope that there's some positive spin-off from any statesmanship that can be exhibited in the meantime.
Our newsroom audience question today is, are there inequities and systemic racism within the health system, or is Christopher Luxon right? Tim, thoughts?
Well, my answers to those parts of that question are yes, yes, and yes. Yes, there's inequity. Yes, there's institutional racism. And yes, Chris Luxon is right if what he said was going on is going on, and I don't believe it is. And what he said was going on is that clinical decisions are being made due to ethnicity. Well, we've learned since then that that's not so. So his claim is that it's wrong to do it, but it's not actually happening in that same context. So I think that the system has got its problems. He's misidentified part of the driver of that problem and the solution. And so he's sort of having an argument with himself and, the group that believes or wants to believe that. Jo, your pieces this week have been outstanding in just getting to the bottom of what it is that's going on, that I think he's taken a broad brush and painted well over the lines of what actually is the intent and the result. So, you spoke, I think, to one of the architects of it. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible what you can find out when you accidentally or unintentionally get to speak to someone that the Health New Zealand doesn't actually want you to be speaking to. But anyway, it was a fascinating interview with one of the architects of that algorithm, which has obviously been a massive talking point at Parliament this week. Now, I'm going to use a prop. For those who are only listening, it's Simon Bridges' National Identity book that he wrote a year or so ago. And it's interesting because Simon Bridges, former national leader, obviously Māori himself, his first chapter is on race, right? And he talks in the book about being quite sick one day and heading to a doctor's surgery in Tauranga where he lives. It was not his normal doctor's surgery. He was unshaven and he was wearing a black hoodie. He waltzed in and he had a Pakeha white doctor come and assess him. And he was quite rude to him. He wasn't interested in Simon Bridges' symptoms, and he made a comment that he was wasting the doctor's time. And then Simon Bridges goes on to say, and then it dawned on me, he was treating me like a bloody Māori. I have no categorical proof of this, and you may think I am being overly sensitive, but I am sure of it. The medical practice covered a low decile, high Māori population. I wasn't suited and booted and clean-shaven. I didn't have my business cards. The doctor had stereotyped me, young, unshaven, hoodie, brown, Māori. Now that, to me, is fascinating because that is the experience for a lot of people. And I would say that that is a pretty good example of what is systemic racism within the health system. And when you've got a former National Party leader who has experienced that and put it in writing and published it, I just am quite puzzled as to why Christopher Luxon thought that this was a good track to go down this week to argue that it doesn't exist. Because it just simply isn't true. There is so much data, there are so many papers, there's so much research. And honestly, when Chris Luxon told Maureen Pugh, who was in a little bit of climate denying mode, that she needed to go away and do some reading, I would argue that Chris Luxon, I've got some homework I can give him and he should go and do some reading because he's massively fallen into systemic racism denier mode, and I just find it utterly bizarre. Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you've enjoyed. Sam?
Yes, I very much enjoyed Richard Harman's piece on Politic about the future of local government review and some of the tricky political questions it's raised for the government, having just kind of got the Three Waters disaster off their back or kicked it into the long grass. You've now got some similar issues around centralisation being raised by that report, whether we sort of have an amalgamation of some local authorities, which I think can make sense in terms of policy, but politically very difficult. So I think he's kind of raised some good points in terms of how this may or may not be received by Chris Hipkins and the other government ministers.
What's your shout out this week, Tim?
Mine's a watch, and it's a video that was posted to Twitter. The link for that will be on Newsroom on the Raw Politics story that goes with this podcast. But the video is from a public meeting in Wanaka that Chris Luxon did. He takes a question from an anti-mandator asking why MPs and Luxon himself hadn't come out to talk to the protest at Parliament. Luxon's answer is really good, and it's direct, and he ends up saying, you're welcome, sir, to vote for somebody else. And I think that was good. His general discussion was a bit corporate speak like he does, but his conclusion was what it needed to be, and good on him.
And my recommendation this week, following on from the health inequities stuff that we're just talking about, is Nicholas Jones, the health reporter at the Herald, did a really good explainer this week on surgery wait lists, just talked through the fact that ethnicity has been part of the criteria for prioritising those routine elective surgeries for quite some time, and why it has been an important part of that. So highly recommend going and having a look at that one. Well, that's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, and our readers, listeners and watchers. Thank you to Sam and Tim. And Sam, Bon voyage. Have a great time. We will miss you.
I'm not dying. I'm just going on a very long holiday. But thank you. I will miss you all as well.
And Joe, bon voyage to you as well. Next week, the two of these guys will be in foreign parts, so I'll be flying solo with soliloquies on politics, for those who are into those. No, I'll be joined by other editors and political reporters from Newsroom. And over the months that Sam's away, I'm hoping we'll be joined by a roster of fine minds from both Newsroom and maybe some guest posts as well. And Sam, we want you responding when your bandwidth literally is possible in Greece and southern Turkey and Ceylon and everywhere else you'll be.
Look, I'll make sure I'm somewhere with a fibre connection, just for you, Tim.
Well, you can find us next week. Well, you can find Tim at least. Same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.